know, it was sort of sprung from research done by John Austin, which started with the discovery of so-called performative utterances. Not that he was the first one to have noticed that, but at least he coined the phrase performative utterance, and he made much of it. So performative utterance, what was interesting to Austin was there was this claim that declarative sentences, basically their role is to say how things are, to state facts, and they have truth conditions. They describe state of affairs such that if the state of affairs actually obtains, the sentence is true, otherwise the sentence is false. So there was this idea, and he wanted to point out that actually there is more to basically speech than just description of the state of affairs, and in particular, in the case of performative utterances, they look like ordinary indicative sentences, but actually their job is not to say how things are, to describe reality, and to be true or false. They have a totally different job to do. So an example of a performative utterance is something like, I named this ship the Queen Elizabeth, in a certain context in which there is this guy holding the champagne bottle in front of a ship and smashing the bottle to hull of the ship and saying those words, I hereby name this ship the Queen Elizabeth. And what Austin said was that when you do that, you're not actually saying, you're not stating a fact, you're actually doing something. You're actually naming the ship. What you're doing is the thing which is the sentence actually says what you are doing when you utter the sentence. And there is a sort of self-reference involved, which is made explicit via the phrase hereby. You can say, I hereby do this, I hereby name the ship. So the role of this sentence, performative utterances, is to actually do certain things, to perform certain sort of social acts like naming the ship. And that's very different from just stating a fact, like there is a bottle in front of me. That's very different. Here I'm stating the fact, I'm saying something true or false. I'm describing the state of affairs, but in the case of performative utterances, there is no difference between the state of affairs that the sentence seems to describe and what the sentence actually does. There is only one thing. The utterance is the state of affairs it talks about. There is not a difference between, say, speech and the reality that it bears on. The speech itself is the reality it bears on, something like this. Anyway, there was this discovery, there's something very special happening in the case of performative utterances. Here it seems that speech is used to do things, it's not just a matter of saying things. And then there were different extensions. There are two major extensions of the idea. First extension is that if you try to see how far that extends, the sort of acts that you can perform in this manner, you see that, for example, an obvious example would be something like, suppose you're in the army and the general and ordering someone to do something, so I can say, I hereby order you to do that thing. And in this way, I use a performative utterance to actually perform this act of ordering. And the act of ordering is a social act, a bit like naming a ship. It's something that happens against the background of a certain institution, so on and so on. It has certain felicity conditions. So this is another act that you can perform using a performative utterance. But what the extension I'm talking about, the interesting extension, is that Austin said that obviously this very act, which you can perform by means of a performative utterance, the act of ordering someone to do something, you can also perform that act in a more implicit manner, not using the performative utterance, not saying I hereby order you or something, not naming the act that you perform and making explicit which act it is that you're performing. But you can do this implicitly simply by saying, so the example I have here is I order you to leave at once. Instead of saying that, I can say simply leave at once. And it can be perfectly clear from the context that I'm the superior, I'm ordering you something. And I can add something like, that's an order, if I want to make it explicit what the utterance was. But the first utterance, leave at once, is already an order, albeit possibly an implicit one. So there is this extension from the acts which you can perform explicitly by means of performative utterances. You can also perform implicitly. And Austin said that utterances like leave at once are themselves performative because they are used to perform this act. But they are sort of implicit or primary performative as opposed to the explicit performatives. I order you to perform the act. An explicit performative names the act which it is used to perform. while an implicit performative actually performs the act, is used to perform the same act but in a more implicit manner. So that's a sort of extension. We see that there are more performative utterances than meets the eye. Instead of, they are not just the explicit performative, but the others also are used to perform acts. First extension. Second extension, once you have something like, I order you to leave at once, considered as an explicit performative, used to actually perform the act of ordering, the same act which can also be performed implicitly. Why not consider that, of course, there is also, I promise you to leave at once, and this is in the same ballpark. But what about, I hereby assert that the earth is round. Suppose that you're making this official statement. Is this not also an explicit performative? Yes, it is in a way. Because by saying that, and also you can say hereby, as I've just done, by saying that you're actually performing the act of assertion. And if you think of it, the act of assertion, it's a bit like the act of ordering. You're sort of taking up a certain role, you're giving your work for the thing that you, however you describe that, maybe there is a description of this act of assertion which makes it look a bit like the act of ordering or promising, a sort of social act which involves certain commitments and so on and so forth. This, at any rate, formally looks very much like an explicit performative. So Austin says, okay, this is another one, and there are also felicity conditions for assertion, just as there are for the other type of act. So he wanted to extend the notion of an explicit performative to cases like I hereby assert that, or I state that. But of course, you also have this notion of an implicit performative or primary performative. That is, in the case of I order you to leave at once, you have the explicit version, I order you, and you have the implicit version, leave at once. And that's the same act which is performed implicitly or explicitly. Now in the case, if you accept that I hereby assert that the earth is round, also is an explicit performative, then you must accept that there is also this sort of implicit counterpart. The primary performative would be simply saying the earth is round. If you say the earth is round, you're actually stating or asserting that the earth is round, but in a less explicit manner than when you say I hereby assert that the earth is round. Now, if you accept that, that means that we started with a contrast between performative and transitive utterances. Transitive utterances are just utterances of declarative sentences that are used to say how things are, to state facts. Like the earth is round is used to say that the earth is round, or there is a bottle in front of me is used to say that there is a bottle in front of me. As opposed to performative utterances that are used to do something, like I named this ship the Queen Elizabeth. And now we see that there are other utterances that are used to do things than those explicit performatives. If I say leave at once, I'm also doing something, I'm ordering you to leave. And if I say the earth is round, now we see, I'm also performing an act. I'm the act of asserting the earth is round. And it turns out now that instead of saying that there is a class of sentences that are used to perform acts rather than merely stating how things are, we see that every utterance seems to be used to perform an act. Whenever I say something, I make an assertion, I give an order, I make a promise. Actually, it's whenever every utterance has this dimension of is an act. And that means that, so this is really the change that Austin describes in the book, How to Do Things with Words. We start with this contrast between performative and transitive utterances, and we end up with a view according to which every utterance is an action, a type of act. Every utterance is used to perform a speech act. Not just certain utterances, but all of them, including assertions, including ordinary transitive utterances are perform acts just as the others do. So now we have a different theory. That's Austin's second theory. The first theory was the theory of performative utterances as opposed to transitive utterances, and now we have a new theory, the theory of illocutionary acts, the idea that every utterance is used to perform a certain sort of act, which he calls an illocutionary act, like asserting, ordering, asking a question, making a promise, advising, whatever. So that's the theory. And speech act theory is really the theory of illocutionary acts. Now, what's interesting about this background that I've just provided by looking at Austin's theory and his development, what's interesting is that shortly after the publication of Austin's lectures, some people among his followers, his close followers, noticed a annoying ambiguity in the notion of an illusory act, which really covers two things that are very, very different. And that was the problem. So the paper I recommend on this is, I guess that was the first person to notice, is Peter Strawson, was very sympathetic to Austin's theory, and he noticed that there was this ambiguity in this paper of intention and convention in speech acts. So the ambiguity is this. If you read Austin, you see that illusory acts are a certain sort of social act, an institutional act, like naming a ship. There are certain conditions, not anyone can do that. You have to be in a certain context, you have to have a bottle of champagne, a ship in front of you, you have to be invested with a certain authority, and when all those conditions are met, which are felicity conditions, you have to do something. There is a certain procedure. The procedure involves smashing the bottle to the bottom of the ship and saying, I named the ship, something like this. So that's really a sort of institutional act, which is conventional and so on and so on. So that's as felicity conditions. So that's basically what Austin says about illusory acts. Social institutional acts, obeying certain conventions, involving felicity conditions. That's one thing. But if you look at what people call illusory act in the literature that stem from Austin's work, in particular starting with John Searle's book, Speech Acts, published in 1969, you see that what people call an illusory act is something very different. It's a speech act in the sense that the sort of act that you perform whenever you say something. Not a very specific institutional act, but something very common. Any utterance in any context, need not be institutional. When I'm speaking now, I'm performing speech acts. When we are in a normal conversation, we're performing speech acts. It doesn't seem that we're talking about institutional or social acts now, but we're talking about things that have to do with the use of language, the common use of language. And it doesn't seem that those acts, the speech acts that we perform when we speak normally, as it were, it doesn't seem that those acts have felicity conditions in the sense that Austin was interested in, because to perform a speech act like asking a question, it seems that the only thing that is required, the only condition that has to be satisfied, is what Austin calls a condition of uptake. You must understand what I'm doing. You must grasp my intention. So if you understand that I'm saying something and that that thing is intended as a question to you, to which you should give an answer, if you have understood that, then I succeeded in asking a question. Asking a question is only a matter of getting you to recognize my intention to ask a question. And no further condition seems to be imposed on the speech act. At least this is the sort of view that Strawson himself tried to suggest was the right approach. By what he did actually was to connect Austin's idea about illusory acts with Rice's idea about communication and non-natural meaning, so-called non-natural meaning. Rice's idea was that in communication what's essential is the recognition of the speaker's communicative intention. You have certain intention when you speak, and you actually succeed in communicating as soon as this hearer recognizes your intention. And a very striking example given by Searle of this sort of the fact that communication rests on intention recognition. A very striking example, he gives the example of greeting someone. So you see someone, in the street, and you greet that person, you want to say hello to them. And you can do that by all sorts of conventional means. You can say a certain gesture with the head, or you can, if you have a hat, you can raise your hat, or you can say hello, there are many ways of doing this, but you have not actually succeeded in greeting the person if the person doesn't recognize your intention. Then you fail. Whatever you do, if the person doesn't understand that you're actually greeting him or her, you fail to greet him or her. On the other hand, whatever you do, doesn't matter what you do, which sign you use, it can be a totally novel sign that no one ever used before. It doesn't matter what you do. As soon as the other recognizes your intention by this gesture, whatever it is, to greet her or him, you have succeeded in greeting him or her. So it seems that the recognition of the speaker's communicative intention is necessary and sufficient for the satisfaction of that intention, that is, for the communication to take place. So that's the Gricean idea, basically a sort of a strong version of the Gricean idea. There are all sorts of variants of that idea, but that's, and Strawson thought what's essential to communicative acts is actually that Gricean property. It rests on intention recognition, no felicity condition, only the uptake condition. And that's the reason why Strawson thought that there are really different beasts under the name of illusory act. There is on the one hand an communicative act, a Gricean communicative act that rests on intention recognition. On the other hand, there is this social institutional acts that depends upon specific conventions and that has felicity conditions. And those are different things, he said. And that's a mistake to say that there is a single theory that will encompass both. That's basically the gist of the Strawson paper, of the Strawson 64 paper, which I strongly recommend. Okay, let's consider these two types of act in turn. So the social institutional acts, the sort of acts that Austin was talking about and that he was interested in, are acts like betting. I bet you $100 or whatever. But betting or baptizing, that's the example of the ship, or you can baptize a baby. Excommunicating, that's the sort of example that Austin gives. Clearly, excommunication is not a speech act in the ordinary sense. It's really an institutional act, something that the Pope does. Well, it's not. That's the sort of thing that he was interested in. Or opening the session, authorizing. So that's the. We just look up the list of acts in Austin's work. So those acts are performed by saying something or in saying something, as Austin says, but insists they are more than a mere speech act. They are not speech acts. You use speech in order to perform an institutional act against the background of a complex institution, when there's a procedure and so on. It's not just a matter of saying things. And they have legal or institutional consequences. They are the creation of obligations and rights and that sort of thing. And actually those acts were, before Austin, they were thoroughly analyzed in a book that I also recommend by Adolf Reinach, The A Priori Foundations of the Civil Law, in which he talks about those social acts, he talks about performative utterances, and he has a quite detailed story of what those acts are, and where the sort of legal dimension is really essential. That's very different from speech acts, as people like Searle talk about them. Speech acts, or we might say, disambiguate, communicative acts, they are acts like asserting, asking questions, warning, requesting, greeting, advising, and so on and so forth. And as I said, whenever we speak, unless perhaps the utterance is non-serious, whenever we speak seriously, that's another issue, what we do when we speak non-seriously, which of course happens all the time, which is another issue, which actually relates to fiction, but there's a lot of fiction in speech, which is all the time we speak not fully seriously, but anyway, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Whenever we speak, we perform such a communicative act resting on the mechanism of intention recognition. Okay, now, my take on this ambiguity, so when I mentioned the ambiguity, I mentioned Strawson, but there are other people who are really, they were close followers of Austin, was actually disciples of Austin. You say disciples or disciples? Warnock, 1973, and Urmson, 1977, they all said the same thing. There are these two things, they are different. We shouldn't claim that it's a single thing. So they all criticize Austin, and I think we can defend Austin. And my idea in my old book called Meaning and Force, which is even older than this because there was a French edition much earlier. In that book, what I said is that there is actually this notion that Austin was interested in, this notion of illusory act. That's a unitary notion, so he was right in a way. But this notion of illusory act, this is Janus face, it has two sides, but it's two sides of the same coin. That was Austin's insight. So those acts are both communicative acts, that's one side, and if the circumstances are appropriate, they become social acts. So I'll give an example, because I think it's very clear on an example. And that's an example in which we have different phrases corresponding to these two acts. It's easier to understand. Normally we use the same verb to refer to one or the other of the acts that are the two sides of the same coin. So take the example of the act of opening the session. There is a certain assembly and someone is the president, and the president opens the session by saying the session is open, or I hereby open the session, or I declare the session open. There are all sorts of ways, all sorts of things you can say. But what's interesting is that we can distinguish between the act of declaring the session open. Declaring the session open is not quite the same thing as actually opening the session. And I'm saying that because in order to declare the session open, the only thing that's necessary is for your audience to understand that your intention in saying what you say is actually to open the session by saying that the session is open. But declaring the session declaring the session open is performing a communicative act which rests on intention recognition. So suppose I'm not the president of the session. Suppose I'm not authorized to open the session. Suppose I'm a madman. I believe that I'm the president, but I'm not. So I can say the session is open, or I can say I declare the session open. And you will understand my intention. You will understand that I'm declaring the session open. But you will also understand that I'm not authorized to open the session. And that will be a case in which I will have actually declared the session open, but I will not have opened the session because I'm not the authorized person. So I suggest that declaring the session open is an illocutory act in the weak sense, that is a communicative act or a speech act that expresses a certain intention to do something. The intention you express here is the intention to open the session as the president can do. But the act of opening the session itself is an illocutory act in the strong sense. It's a social act that depends upon certain conditions that can only be performed if the conditions are satisfied, the felicity conditions. You have to be the president, you have to be authorized, there are certain conditions, again. And the connection between the two is that normally, if the conditions are satisfied, if you're the president and if you declare the session open, you will thereby have opened the session. Declaring the session open is sufficient to open the session if the felicity conditions are actually satisfied, are met. But the conditions may not be satisfied. If you simply express this intention of opening the session, but when the conditions are not satisfied, you've still performed the speech act of declaring the session open. But you've not managed to perform the social act. So this distinction between the weak, illocutory act in the weak sense, just expressing the intention, performing this communicative act, getting the intention across, the other realizes what your intention is. This is the speech act that you perform via this Christian mechanism of intention recognition. But this becomes an illocutory act in the strong sense only if the felicity conditions are satisfied and the intention that you express and that the other recognizes can actually be fulfilled because you are actually invested with the right authority. In this case, you are actually opening the session because you are the president. On this view, notice this is not exactly the view that you find in the literature where the Gricean view is expounded. Namely, people think that this stuff about intention recognition, this really involves a form of reflexivity. You manage to perform an illocutory act by getting the other to realize or to recognize that this is that you're actually performing that act. Or basically, the intention to perform an illocutory act is fulfilled via the hearer's recognition of that intention. As if, and here what I'm saying is not exactly that. There are actually two acts, even though they are two sides of the same coin. There is this strong social act. That's what you intend. That's what you express the intention of performing. But the expression of the intention and the recognition of the intention are not constitutive of the performance of that act, because there are further conditions that have to be satisfied, namely the felicity conditions. But the recognition of the intention, the expression and recognition of the intention is constitutive of the performance of the communicative act, which is only the weak side, as it were, of the whole thing. So it's not totally fully reflexive, or there is a self-referential component, but it's not fully reflexive. Which means basically that the illogical act in the weak sense, the communicative act, is the act of making public the intention to perform an illogical act in the strong sense. That's why it's not fully reflexive. The weak act is the act of making public the intention to perform the strong act. Which means that the intention expressed by the speaker who says the session is open is the intention to open the session, not just the intention to declare the session open. So even if you're the madman and so on, your intention, the intention you express is the intention to go beyond just speech and to actually open the session by your words. So making that intention public suffices for performing the speech act of declaring the session, but not for actually opening the session. Okay, so that's my take on this ambiguity of, and also on my attempted justification of Austin's take on this, on Austin's insights. Yes. Now there is a third kind of act. So there is the illusionary act, which has these two sides, with the speech act and the social act. And there is this interesting relation between the weak illusionary act and the strong illusionary act. One is aiming at the other, as it were. But Austin says that we perform an illusionary act on these two sides in saying something. So in order to perform an illusionary act, we have to say something. And there is the illusionary act with, again, two components of it, or two aspects of it. There is the illusionary act, but there is also the act of saying, which is used to perform the illusionary act. The act of saying is what Austin calls the locutionary act. And it's a very vexed issue, what exactly a locutionary act is. And actually in speech act theory, people like Searle have just given up this notion of locutionary act as irremediably confused. And I want to say something about this notion of locutionary act. So an example, sort of example that Austin gives, the speaker who says, I will be there, performs the locutionary act, namely the act of saying that he will be there. Saying that is a locutionary act. And in performing that locutionary act, in saying that he would be there, the speaker performs an illocutionary act, namely, for example, the act of promising that he would be, or the act of announcing, or the act of predicting. There are different possibilities, different possible illocutionary acts that you might perform by saying, I will be there, which is a sort of an implicit performative. So what actually is the illocutionary force of the act depends upon the context, different possible illocutionary acts. But you perform all these illocutionary acts by actually saying that you will be there, which is the locutionary act. So that's the sort of example. And as far as the theoretical characterization goes, what Austin says is that the locutionary act is the act of uttering a sentence, like I will be there, with a full sense and reference, with a contextually determinate meaning, he says. That's the locutionary act. While the illocutionary act is the same thing, but in addition, you have a certain force. So you perform the locutionary act when you say, I will be there, and you say that you will be there. You refer to yourself by I, and by there you mean well. So you need to have a determinate sense and reference in mind. You say something, you utter a sentence with a determinate content in context. And if you add the dimension of force, if you utter this with the force of a promise, you're performing the illocutionary act of promising that you will be there. If you utter this with the force of a simple prediction, what's going to happen, you're performing the illocutionary act of predicting that you will be there. So that's how Austin presents things. There's the act of uttering the sentence with a certain meaning, that's the locutionary act, and the act of uttering the sentence with its meaning plus its force, a certain force, that's the illocutionary act. The locutionary act is supposed to abstract from the force, from the illocutionary dimension, illocutionary force. Now, the problem here is that there is this contrast between meaning and force that's essential to Austin. That's a contrast that you also find in Frater, by the way. But it's a problematic contrast because, as Domet pointed out, force is an aspect of the meaning of an utterance. He says, Domet, that force is that part of the meaning of an utterance, a meaning of a sentence even. So in virtue of which he says, the sentence is conventionally understood to express an assertion or not, for example, a comment. And indeed, in sentences, you find that sentences come in different classes. There are sentence types. There are imperative sentences, declarative sentences, interrogative sentences, and they are distinguished by the mood, the sentence mood, and what the sentence mood does is indicate which illocutionary act the sentence is used to perform when it's uttered seriously and literally in isolation. So it seems that there are aspects of the meaning of an utterance, aspect of the meaning of the sentence that pertains to the type of act that you perform when you utter such a sentence. So it's not clear that the meaning on the force can be really separated because there are aspects of meaning that we bear on provide indications concerning the force. And people like Reichenbach, Steiner, Searle, and those people who sort of pioneers of spiritual theory, they typically analyze sentences, the meaning of sentences, by saying that there are two components in the meaning. You take a trio of sentences like is he home, he is home, or let him be home, for Searle, but also for the others. These sentences, they share a common descriptive component. They represent the same state of affairs. The person we're talking about being home, that's the state of affairs. That in Searle's terms, that the proposition that the sentences express, they express the same propositions, so assuming that he refers to the same person, but there's this difference in sentence mood that conveys a certain indication concerning the speech act which the sentence is meant to perform. And so the sentences express the same proposition with different illocutionary forces encoded by the sentence mood, and the analysis of the meaning of the sentence that Searle and the others provide is an analysis in two components. Descriptive content or propositional content P, and F is correspond to the illocutionary force encoded by the sentence mood. That's an analysis of the meaning of the sentence. But that exactly matches the analysis of the speech act performed by the sentence, which itself involves the content, the propositional content, and the force. So there is this notion of expressing a proposition, and Searle even as a name for the act of expressing a proposition is called that the propositional act. So when Austin says that the illocutionary act abstracts from the force, we might think that if we get rid of the force as indicated by sentence mood, what's left is just the neutral proposition expressed by the sentence independent of its mood. So the illocutionary act in that sense would be just Searle's propositional act, the act of expressing a proposition. But that's not at all what Austin actually says. If you look at what Austin actually says, when he talks about the illocutionary act, he has ways of reporting the illocutionary act. He says that the illocutionary act performed by means of the sentence, the cat is on the map, he says that's the act of saying that the cat is on the map. That's what we've seen with the example of I will be there. But he says also that the illocutionary act performed by uttering an imperative sentence like get out, he says that's the act of telling the addressee to get out. That's, he says, the locutionary act. That's very mysterious, because that looks like the illocutionary act. And he says that when we use an interrogative sentence, like, is it in Oxford or Cambridge? Those are all these examples. He says the locutionary act we perform when we say that is the act of asking whether it is in Oxford or Cambridge. That's the locutionary act. That's so strange, because now it seems that the illocutionary act just is an illocutionary act. So clearly, expressions like say that as opposed to ask whether, tell to, track the mood of the uttered sentence. They really correspond to the fact that the sentence that has been used to say something was either an imperative sentence or a declarative sentence or an interrogative sentence. And the mood of the sentence, as we saw, indicates which illocutionary act the sentence is used to perform. At least that's what people believe, that most speech act theorists believe. Now people question this assumption, but I'm not going to talk about that. So what this shows is the fact that for Austin, when he talks about the locutionary act, he takes into account the mood of the sentence by modulating the verb. It says that corresponds to the utterance of an indicative sentence. That's the locutionary act you perform when you use an indicative sentence. But if you use an interrogative sentence, the locutionary act is not the act of saying that, it's the act of asking whether. So that means that the locutionary act takes account of, includes as it were, the contribution of the mood. And that is consistent with Austin's idea that the locutionary act is the act of uttering the sentence with a meaning. And the meaning actually includes the indications provided by the sentence mood concerning the illogical performed by the sentence. That's part of the meaning of the sentence. And for Austin, the illogical is the act of expressing a sentence with a certain meaning. Therefore, the locutory meaning, in Austin's sense, is not the proposition of the force neutral proposition that Searle talks about. It's something much richer that also involves the contribution of sentence mood. And for Searle, Austin's view is simply inconsistent. He says that the locutory act abstracts from the force, that is from the illocutory dimension, but at the same time, when he describes what the locutory act is, when he reports locutory act, and when he talks about locutory meaning, it's predicted for Austin that includes the semantic contribution of the mood, that is the force indicated by the sentence type, force in dominant sense. So it seems that there is an inconsistency here. And Searle proposes to get rid of this notion of locutory act by saying that what Austin calls locutory act is only a generic illocutory act. Of course, when you say, I will be there, that you perform the generic illocutory act of saying that you will be there, and that can be specified in context as the more specific illocutory act of, more specific illocutory act of promising that you will be there, or predicting that you will be there, announcing that you will be there. These are specifications of a generic illocutory act saying that, but that's a generic illocutory act. That's not another type of act. So Searle gives up this Austin's notion of a locutory act, and instead he uses only this distinction between the force neutral proposition and the propositional act, the act of expressing a proposition, versus the fully locutory act of expressing the proposition with a certain force. But I think that Austin, again, can be defended, so this talk is really sort of defense of Austin on several fronts. I think we can defend Austin by distinguishing two notions of force. So when he says that the locutory act abstracts from the force, he means force in one sense, not in the other. As we've seen, there is a notion of force that's just an aspect of the meaning of the utterance. That's what's conveyed by sentence mood and the indications concerning the act of which you perform when you utter the sentence. And for Austin, that's part of the locutory meaning. So the locutory meaning doesn't abstract from force in that sense, but it abstracts from force in another sense. Now the two senses, I don't want to spend too much time on that, I've got to hurry up. But basically, when we think of force, there are two notions, and the two notions can be captured by considering that there is one sense in which force is encoded in speech. As Domet says, there is this aspect of the meaning of a sentence conveyed by, in particular, sentence mood that encodes the sort of speech act, the illocutory act which you perform when you use the sentence. So if the sentence is an interrogative sentence encodes the fact that the speaker who uses that sentence is actually asking a question. That's sort of at least in those views, that's what's encoded. There are aspects of the sentence that correspond to the act which you perform. Indeed, if in order to actually succeed in performing the communicative act, your intention must be recognized, it's important to give clues, to give indications about what it is that you're doing. And precisely sentence moods and other illocutory force indicators are there to provide those indications. So this is part of the meaning of an utterance. This is encoded. This is force as encoded. But there is another notion of force in which force cannot be encoded, as people like Frager and Davidson insisted. Force cannot be encoded. Now, force in what sense? Well, what cannot be encoded is whether or not the speaker is actually performing the speech act which is encoded. So suppose, for example, that you have an interrogative sentence. That encodes the fact that you're asking a question, because that's the design. The interrogative sentences are designed for asking questions. So the sentence indicates that its role is to ask a question. But of course, when you utter an interrogative sentence, you may not ask a question. There are many contexts in which you're not actually asking a question. For example, you can have rhetorical questions, or you can say, is the Pope Catholic? And you're not really asking a question when you're doing this. And in general, so take a declarative sentence. You might say that as Domet says, that the declarative sentence encodes the fact that the speaker is asserting. It's conventionally encodes the assertive force. But of course, you can utter a declarative sentence without asserting. I'm going to give examples in a minute. Note that these two notions of force correspond to an ambiguity in the assertion sign. There are some people, like precisely people I mentioned, like Reichenbach, Searle, and others, who use the assertion sign to distinguish declarative sentences from imperative sentences and interrogative sentences. So the assertion sign corresponds to this aspect of the meaning of declarative sentences, which encode the assertive force, as opposed to interrogative sentences, which are represented using a different question mark as a sign of question. So that's a way of using the assertion sign. But there is another way, which is the Frege way, also Russell. They use the assertion sign to distinguish cases in which they are only talking about declarative sentences, but there is a distinction between the case in which you're merely expressing a proposition with your declarative and the case in which you're actually asserting it. When you're actually making an assertion, that's what they use the assertion sign for. That means that the sentence is actually asserted. That means that, as Frege puts it, that the speaker subscribes to the proposition expressed. And this distinction between two notions of force as encoded and force as corresponding to what you're actually doing, whether you're actually asserting or not. For example, Hare, in his dissertation in 1950, had this clear distinction between two notions. He had actually an analysis of the assertion sign, and he had two distinct functions for it. He calls the first function the tropic, that corresponds to the mood indicator, as he says. So that basically corresponds to sort of the difference between a declarative utterance and an imperative utterance. There's a difference, they don't mean the same thing because they convey different indications regarding the speech act which is being performed. But the other function of the assertion sign is that he says is that of the music, he calls it. And the music indicates the speaker's subscription, whether or not the speaker is serious. And that's the thing that Frege and Davidson talk about. They say that that's something that cannot be encoded. You can encode all you want, but whether the speaker is serious is not something that can be just read off the sentence. You need to look at the context to see whether the speaker is seriously asserting. So there are these two senses, force in the music sense and force in the tropic sense. Now I want to show you examples in which you're not actually performing the speech act, which is nevertheless encoded by the sentence, to show that there are these really two different notions. So cases of so-called echoic uses. So I've got this example from Ducrot. So A says to B, you're an idiot. And B responds, oh, I'm an idiot. That's very kind of you. So that's B's response are two sentences, and they are both locutionary acts. B says that he himself is an idiot, and B says that that's very kind of the speaker to say that. Those things are said, but non-seriously. So when B says, I'm an idiot, he's saying that rather than telling to or asking whether he's performing that sort of locutionary act by virtue of its declarative tropic. But this is not a real assertion because B is merely echoing A's previous assertion. This is just an echo, like a sort of quotation. No assertion is made by B. A is asserting that B is an idiot, but B is not asserting that he himself is an idiot. He's merely echoing B's words. And the same is true for the second sentence. That's very kind of you. Even though B says that's very kind of you, he's performed the locutionary act of saying that that's very kind of the speaker. Still, he's not seriously asserting that that's very kind of him because he's saying that it's ironical. And when you're saying something ironically, you're not actually performing the assertion. You're just portraying or you're doing as if. It's sort of fiction. You're fictionally portraying someone saying that and you're actually making clear that it would be ridiculous to say that because it's just contrary to the fact, something like this. So I think that we can restore Austin's consistency by saying that the locutionary act abstracts from the force in the gnostic sense. It abstracts, when you describe the locutionary act, you're saying what the speaker is saying, but you're not considering whether the speaker is serious or not, which act is actually performing in reality. You're only considering what's encoded in the sentence. So here is my reinterpretation of Austin's locutionary, illocutionary distinction. That's a reinterpretation that goes back to the book, the old book that I mentioned. So I would describe the locutionary act as the act of making an utterance, so actually saying something, using a sentence and so on in context, making an utterance which, in virtue of its meaning, in virtue of what it encodes, presents a certain illocutionary act as being performed. So when you're using an interrogative sentence, you, as it were, present an act of question as being performed. the meaning of the sentence projects a certain illocutionary act as being performed. But of course, that illocutionary act which the sentence itself projects, which is encoded by its meaning, that illocutionary act need not be actually performed because the speaker may do something else. So there are cases of indirect speech acts, for example. You say, can you pass the salt? It looks like a question. You're presenting yourself as asking a question, but you're not really asking a question. You're doing something else. You want the salt, but you want to be polite and so on. So there are all sorts of cases in which the act that is encoded or that is portrayed by the sentence you utter, the act which you present yourself as performing is not actually performed. You're doing something else. And the same is true for cases of irony. Irony and many other sort of cases of language use rest on something like pretense. When the speaker is not serious in general, he or she does not perform the illocutionary act indicated by the sentence, but engages into some form of simulation or pretense. And in those cases, force in the linguistic sense is cancelled. You're not actually performing the act which the sentence presents as being performed. Okay, and to conclude, I want to go back to the beginning of the talk. When I talk about the two types of acts, the two types of locutionary acts, now we see that the illocutionary distinction corresponds to the distinction between the illocutionary act indicated by the sentence in virtue of its conventional meaning, in particular it's the mood of the sentence, and the illocutionary act actually performed. And those are two different things. What's encoded and what you're actually doing are two different things. They can come apart. And the distinction between the locutionary and the illocutionary act and the illocutionary act corresponds to that distinction on my interpretation. And that means that the locutionary act is defined in terms of the illocutionary act, which is the primary notion. The primary notion is the notion of the illocutionary act. And the locutionary act is the act of presenting yourself as performing a certain illocutionary act. And that corresponds to this idea that the meaning of the sentence encodes the sort of act that you perform when you use it. But because there is this hierarchical dependence, the locutionary act is defined in terms of the illocutionary act. That suggests that when we get back to what I said in the first part of the talk, we see that there is a sort of hierarchy of acts. The most basic thing, which is very surprising because, surprising to me because at the time when I wrote that book, I didn't have that in mind at all. I was very much convinced by the Socratian approach. But what really comes first, what's really basic, is the social institutional act. Because the illocutionary act in the weak sense, the communicative act, the speech act, the illocutionary act in the sense of speech act theory, that is defined in terms of the social institutional act, if what I said at the beginning of the talk is correct. Because the illocutionary act in the weak sense, the speech act, is just the act of making public one's intention to perform an act of the first type, that is a social act. The illocutionary act in the weak sense, communicative act, is the act of expressing the intention or getting someone to recognize one's intention to perform an act in the strong sense, the act of type A. So type B acts asymmetrically depend on type A acts in the sense that they are defined in terms of them. And what I said about the locutionary act shows that we have a similar dependence. The locutionary act itself is defined in terms of the illocutionary act in the weak sense. The locutionary act is nothing but the act of indicating the performance of an illocutionary act of type B. So you've got this sort of a hierarchy with, which is basically the take-home lesson of this talk. Thanks.
I don't remember the schedule.
There is coffee break now.
There is coffee break now before questions.
Yeah.
Therefore, coffee break.
Oh, but well,
Okay.
the session was supposed to be 1 hour before the coffee break.
Oh.
I stopped my talk after
So
50 minutes just to let.
So there is.
So we can have some questions and then we can have sort of a general discussion after the coffee break.
I'm going to have Manolos replies and then public audience.
Yeah, there will be Manolos reply as part of
And
the
then-
second part after the coffee break.
Right, and so our question will follow Manolos
Yeah.
reply.
So we can have some questions now.
So I just 3 questions and then.
Yeah, some
Manolo
questions now
replies.
and then we'll have Manolo's response and general
Okay.
discussion. No? Okay, not today.
Will there be questions for?
Should I? Yeah. Thanks. I wanted to ask between like two things you said. So you first said that you can assert, you can make performative out of assertion by saying I hereby assert that. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you said, and then you said that there's a distinction between a weak sense and a strong sense of performatives. Can you make the connection between the two? And I was thinking of an example. Maybe it's what you said. So basically, what do you think about the idea that any speech act can become social in your sense? So any weak, because you said like, every speech act is both weak and strong.
Yes.
But
Are you asking what about assertion?
yeah, so